They told you history was written by the victors. What they didn't tell you was how much of it was erased by the frightened. Listen closely. What I'm about to reveal was never meant to surface. In the spring of 1847, a single purchase at a Charleston auction house would set off a chain of events so disturbing that 3 families buried the records under layers of legal silence. But paper remembers, ink bleeds through time, and tonight you're going to see what those men tried to hide beneath polite society and plantation wealth. Picture it: Ryan's Mart, Charleston, the air thick with sweat, molasses, and the stench of human despair. Men in linen suits sip brandy while appraising flesh like livestock. On the platform stands a figure they call Grace. 17 years old, delicate, silent. The auctioneer's hand trembles as he reads the bill of sale, though no one notices. Something about the girl unsettles him, as if the body before him carries a secret shape that language can't contain. But money dulls suspicion, and the hammer falls fast. Sold $750. That transaction was supposed to disappear into the plantation machinery of the South. Instead, it became a crack in the illusion, a flaw in the code that kept men believing they owned other souls, because Grace was not what she appeared to be. Beneath the dress, beneath the bindings, beneath the careful performance of submission, lived a truth so forbidden it would drive one man mad, another to exile, and a woman to her death. You've heard stories about cruelty, ownership, and power. This is not that story. This is about the mask behind the system, the hidden experiment beneath the veneer of civilization. Every empire has its shadows, and Riverwood Plantation was one of them. Here, behind white columns and Sunday prayers, a master thought he could buy obedience and ended up buying revelation. The world you were taught to trust, the moral order, the laws, the sanctity of social rank, was built on documents just like that forged bill of sale. Every signature, every title, every oath was a spell, and those who understood how to twist language could shape reality itself. The auctioneer, the buyer, the judge, they all played roles in a ritual older than they knew, a ritual of control disguised as commerce. Lean in, because from this point on, every word you hear pulls you deeper. Once you see what Riverwood was, you'll never see history the same way again. Riverwood stood like a monument to denial, 800 acres of perfection, white columns, black soil, and blood money disguised as civility. To the passerby, it was a picture of order, the scent of tobacco curing in the barns, the shimmer of fields under a spring sun, and the faint echo of hymns from enslaved voices that had learned to sing obedience. But if you listened closely, the air carried something else. A hum beneath the surface, like a house that knew what it had done. When Grace arrived, the house reacted. Animals grew restless. The cook claimed she heard whispering in the halls at night. Old Patience, the head servant who'd lived there since before Isaiah Vanderhorst's birth, crossed herself whenever Grace passed. She told no one why, but her eyes followed the girl as if recognizing something that didn't belong among the living. Isaiah himself felt the shift. A man who once commanded silence now found the silence watching him. He couldn't name the unease, only that it began the morning Grace stepped onto the veranda. A slight figure in a faded blue dress, her head bowed, her presence somehow larger than her size. His new wife, Catherine, thanked him dutifully for the purchase, unaware that her life had just become the hinge of a secret centuries old. The first weeks passed in uneasy rhythm. Grace moved through the house like a shadow, efficient, silent, graceful to a fault. She obeyed without hesitation, learned Catherine's routines with unnatural precision, and seemed to anticipate needs before they were spoken. But Catherine began to notice small distortions. Footsteps in the hall when everyone slept. Mirrors fogging in empty rooms. The faint scent of iron and rain when Grace entered, like something wild and storm-born following her. Isaiah dismissed his wife's unease as female nerves, but even he began to dream. of ink bleeding across ledgers, of voices whispering from the floorboards of Sarah, his dead first wife, calling from her locked room. The dreams left him shaking. You see, every structure built on domination becomes a vessel for the energy it denies. Riverwood was full, soaked through with generations of pain disguised as order. And when Grace walked through its doors, she wasn't just entering that energy. She was awakening it. What Isaiah thought he bought was obedience. What he really purchased was a mirror, and soon, that mirror would show him what kind of man he truly was. The first night it happened, no one spoke of it in the morning. Catherine awoke to find the curtains open, though she'd latched them herself before sleep. A single candlestick had been moved from her vanity to the floor beside the bed. Wax pooled like spilled blood across the wood. Grace was standing near the window, motionless, eyes unfocused, as if listening to something just beyond hearing. When Catherine called her name, she turned slowly, her face soft and unreadable. "You should not leave the windows closed, ma'am," she whispered. "It keeps the house from breathing." Catherine wanted to scold her, to reassert control, but something in Grace's tone, gentle yet absolute, froze the words on her tongue. She simply nodded, uneasy, and Grace returned to her duties as if nothing had occurred. But from that morning on, nothing felt right. In the days that followed, Catherine began noticing things. The way Grace's shadow sometimes stretched longer than her body, the way her reflection in the mirror seemed slightly delayed. She would find household ledgers, rewritten in a finer hand than her own, small corrections made to Isaiah's accounts, always accurate, always profitable, but impossible to explain. And once, passing by the locked door of Sarah Vanderhorst's old room, Catherine thought. She heard a woman's voice from inside whispering, "Not again." Isaiah, for his part, began to see in Grace what he'd lost in Sarah. Obedience without question, softness without complaint. But beneath that obedience flickered intelligence, and it unsettled him. Grace spoke rarely, but when she did, her words carried an uncanny precision. "A house remembers its master's sins," she told him once while polishing the silver. "You polish it, but you never erase the reflection." He laughed it off, though something in his gut tightened. The nights grew longer. Catherine's sleep fractured into restless fragments. Isaiah withdrew into his study, muttering over ledgers that no longer balanced, and Grace moved like a silent current between them, binding the house in invisible threads of tension. Then, one evening, Catherine entered the parlor to find Isaiah, staring at Grace with an expression she had never seen before. Something between recognition and fear. Grace stood perfectly still, her gaze locked on his, as if daring him to remember something he'd buried long ago. The air between them pulsed, heavy, electric. Catherine spoke his name. Neither of them answered. By midsummer, Riverwood had turned against its master. The house creaked in the heat, walls sweating resin, mirrors tarnishing faster than they could be polished. Isaiah blamed weather, insects, anything but conscience. Yet every night, something drew him from his bed to the locked corridor, where his first wife had died. He would stand there for hours, listening. Sometimes he thought he heard a faint scraping, like nails tracing letters through the wood. Grace began humming while she worked. Low, tuneless sounds that made the dogs whine. Patience warned her to stop. "That song don't belong here," the old woman whispered. "It calls things you can't send back." Grace only smiled. "It's already here." Catherine tried to keep order, clinging to ritual. Tea at 4, church on Sundays, household accounts in neat columns. But her handwriting began to change. Slanting into the same precise script Grace used when she copied Bible verses in the evening. Sometimes Catherine would wake with ink on her fingers and no memory of writing. One night, Isaiah caught sight of Grace crossing the hall, a candle in her hand. Her shadow wavered against the wall, broad-shouldered, unmistakably male. The flame guttered, The shape returned to normal. He told himself it was exhaustion, drink, imagination. But doubt moved in like a tenant that wouldn't pay rent. Riverwood's social circle began to notice. Invitations stopped coming. The overseer quit without explanation, saying the fields felt wrong. Even the parish minister refused communion at the estate chapel after seeing the symbol burned into the altar cloth. A spiral inside a circle, drawn in ash. No one admitted to making it. Catherine's loneliness turned to fascination. Grace listened when her husband would not. Grace's eyes, dark and still, seemed to see through every pretense. "You don't belong to him," Grace whispered one evening while brushing her hair. "You belong to what you fear." The words sank deep, blooming into dangerous curiosity. Isaiah sensed it. Power was slipping, not through rebellion but through awakening. His wife no longer flinched beneath his voice. The servants watched him without deference. And Grace moved through the halls like the house itself had given her command. It was then Isaiah decided to reassert dominion. He ordered the locks changed, the windows barred, and Grace confined to the attic room, once used for discipline. But when the carpenter came to nail the door shut, the wood split under his hammer, as if rejecting the act. He left that day and never returned. By August, Riverwood no longer obeyed its master. The house seemed to breathe without wind, sighing through its walls, shifting in the heat. Isaiah felt it most in the hours before dawn, when shadows lengthened and the ticking of the clock slowed, as if time itself refused to move under his command. He had once ruled with ledgers and lashes, but now his power dissolved into whispers he couldn't silence. Grace was confined, but not contained. Servants reported hearing her voice from the attic at night, though her door was bolted. Not crying, singing. A low, rhythmic chant that threaded through the rafters, vibrating through the bones of the house. Patience begged him to release her. "You can't trap what ain't yours," she said. "That one's half in this world, half in the next." Isaiah struck her for insolence, but her eyes held no fear, only pity. Catherine grew pale and distant. She spent hours in Sarah's old room, now unlocked, reading by candlelight the diaries left behind by the first wife. Pages filled with desperate scripture, notes about the woman Isaiah kept hidden before her death, and entries written in a trembling hand about the voice that moves between us. The last line, barely legible, read, "It wears a face I once loved." One evening, Catherine defied her husband and went to the attic herself. She found Grace kneeling before the window, wrists bound, eyes closed. "You shouldn't be here," Grace said softly. "He'll come for you next." When Catherine demanded to know who, Grace opened her eyes, and something vast and terrible looked out through them. "The one who bought me," she said, "the one who sold him his illusion." That night, Isaiah dreamed of a marketplace that never ended, rows of human forms standing motionless as parchment contracts unfurled from the sky. He saw his name written over and over, beside words he didn't understand: bond, ritual, inheritance. When he awoke, ink stained his palms. By morning, Catherine was sick with fever, whispering Grace's name in delirium. Isaiah locked the attic door himself this time and nailed it shut. But when he turned, Grace was standing behind him, calm, unmarked, holding the nails in her open palm. "You can't seal what you summoned," she said. By September, sleep no longer offered escape. Isaiah would close his eyes and find himself standing in that impossible marketplace again. Columns of smoke for walls, the air thick with the scent of burnt parchment. The auctioneer's voice echoed endlessly, calling names not of people, but of debts. And every time the gavel struck, he felt a pulse in his own chest, as though his heart itself were collateral. He'd wake drenched in sweat, the shape of Grace's face flickering at the edge of the dream. Not the soft, featured servant he had bought, but something older, sharper, neither woman nor man, an androgynous being crowned in firelight. He told himself it was guilt, exhaustion, the fever infecting Catherine. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had invited something into Riverwood that could not be expelled, because it had always been here, waiting for him to see it. The servants began leaving without notice. Horses bolted, food spoiled within hours, mirrors cracked along a perfect diagonal, each fracture dividing reflection from reality. Catherine's fever deepened. She spoke in voices not her own. Sometimes that of Sarah, sometimes of a child, sometimes something that made Isaiah's blood run cold. You traded breath for dominion, it hissed. Now dominion will take your breath. He confronted Grace again, trembling with rage, holding a Bible like a weapon. What are you? He demanded. She looked at him with calm pity. Exactly what you paid for, she said, a servant. You just never asked whose. Her voice deepened, layered, resonant with something vast beneath it. The candlelight bent toward her as if drawn by gravity. Your kind built an empire on ownership. She continued. You bound the living with ink and called it law. You bought blood and called it faith. Every contract you signed fed the same altar. I am that altar, Master Vanderhorst. I am the record you thought was yours to write. Isaiah struck her then. But his hand passed through air thick as smoke. The impact landed on himself. Blood welled across his cheek where none had touched him. Grace smiled faintly. The house remembers the hands that built it. That night, he burned every ledger in the study, the fire roaring high enough to scorch the ceiling. But when dawn came, the books sat neatly stacked on his desk, unburned, waiting. The ink inside them glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. The morning Catherine discovered she was with child, the air in Riverwood changed. It was as if the house inhaled and never exhaled again. The servants whispered behind doors, afraid to say what they suspected. Isaiah walked the halls like a man already condemned, his mind gnawed by the one question he could not ask aloud. How could it be his? He hadn't touched her in months. The fever had burned her body cold to his, her nights filled with half-conscious murmurs of names that were not his own. When she told him, her voice shook with something between awe and fear. It isn't possible, she whispered, but it's true. Her eyes were strange, wider, deeper, as if reflecting a light no one else could see. Isaiah's first thought was betrayal. His second was terror, because Grace had been confined, never left alone with Catherine, or so he believed. Yet, when he confronted her, Grace only smiled. The seed in her doesn't come from flesh, she said softly. It comes from what this house remembers. He struck her again, desperate for something human in her face, but there was only calm, something too ancient for pain. You wanted heirs, she said, and the land answered you. It's always been hungry for what men promise and never pay. Catherine began to dream the same dreams as Isaiah, the marketplace, the burning ledgers, the voices offering ownership in exchange for blood. She started writing in her sleep again, pages filled with symbols Isaiah couldn't read, spirals, eyes, and words in a language that made his teeth ache when he tried to pronounce them. When the physician arrived from Richmond, he lasted less than an hour before leaving without explanation. His hands shook as he packed his bag. She carries something, he muttered, and it's not for this world. Grace cared for Catherine gently, almost reverently. The others refused to enter her chamber. The walls themselves began to pulse with a faint hum, like the heartbeat of something vast and buried beneath the floorboards. Isaiah tried to pray, but the words tangled in his mouth, turning to ash on his tongue. That night, he awoke to find Grace standing beside his bed, holding one of his own burned ledgers, open, unmarked, pristine. Every master, she whispered, thinks he owns the story. But some stories write the master instead. Autumn came, and Riverwood sank into silence. The fields lay untended, the air heavy with rot. No birds sang in the trees. Even the river, once loud with current, seemed to hold its breath as Catherine's belly swelled beyond reason. She moved like someone remembered, her skin pale as wax, her eyes following things that weren't there. Isaiah forbade anyone from speaking of the child. He told himself it was his, that sin could be erased with enough denial. But the servants had already begun to leave offerings outside Catherine's door. Salt, sage, bits of iron. They said they heard the child whisper at night. They said it knew their names. Grace was always near her. She never slept, never ate in sight of others. When Catherine's contractions began months too early, Grace ordered everyone out of the room. No one must see, she said. This birth belongs to the house. Isaiah waited in the hall, pacing like a caged thing, his knuckles bleeding from prayer. The sounds from behind that door were not human. The cries rose and fell in pitches too precise, almost musical, as if language itself were being born. Then silence. A silence so complete that even the crickets outside stopped their song. When the door finally opened, Grace stood in the threshold, her dress unstained, her face serene. "It's done," she said. "She's resting." Isaiah pushed past her, desperate to see. Catherine lay still on the bed, her chest barely rising. Beside her, swaddled in linen, something moved. But not like a child. Its breath came in soft pulses of light, golden and trembling. He reached for it, and felt the floor tilt beneath him. "It bears your name," Grace said behind him, "but not your blood." He turned to her, trembling. "What is it?" Her eyes glowed faintly in the candlelight. "Justice," she whispered. "The debt that built this place finally asked to be born." Isaiah stumbled backward, choking on the truth. The ledgers, the contracts, the bodies beneath the fields. All of it was payment. Every act of ownership had been an invocation. And now the sum was due. The child began to cry, a sound like wind moving through stone. Catherine's eyes opened unfocused, and she smiled faintly. "It's beautiful," she murmured. Isaiah fell to his knees. Grace watched, impassive, as if witnessing the end of something long promised. The days after the birth dissolved into a fever of impossible hours. Light no longer obeyed time at Riverwood. It came and went as it pleased, spilling across the floors at midnight, vanishing at noon. Clocks stopped. Shadows grew without cause. The house had become a living thing, pulsing in rhythm with the child's breath. Isaiah refused to look at it. He kept to his study, drink replacing prayer, his Bible open but unread. Yet even there he could feel it, the hum. It vibrated through the walls, through the floorboards, through his bones. The baby never cried again after that first night. It only listened. Grace carried it from room to room, as if showing it its inheritance. Whispering things Isaiah could not bear to hear, Catherine drifted between worlds. Sometimes she spoke in riddles, other times in voices that were not her own. One old, one childlike, one that spoke his full name with such clarity it froze his heart. "Isaiah Vanderhorst." It said through her lips, "You signed with ink and blood. Now both are collected." At night, he would wake to the sound of scratching behind the walls. When he pressed his ear against the wood, he heard murmurs, pages turning, quills writing. His ledgers were writing themselves. Names filled every margin: overseers, servants, men long dead, all connected by a single, growing line that led back to him. On the 7th night, Isaiah followed Grace into the nursery. The air was thick, metallic, humming with unseen movement. The crib stood in the center, though it was less a cradle now and more an altar. Wood darkened by oil, symbols etched into the grain. The child lay within, eyes open, pupils wide as eclipses. They reflected him perfectly, except for one difference. Where his reflection should have been, he saw chains. Grace turned toward him, her face calm. "You wanted a legacy," she said. "Every man of your line did. The land remembers, and now it has given you one." He stepped closer, trembling. "It's not human." Grace's expression softened. "No, Isaiah, it's exactly human. It's what your kind becomes when ownership replaces mercy." Then the baby smiled, an ancient, knowing smile. and every candle in the room went out at once. The next morning, Isaiah's study was empty. His Bible lay open to Exodus, a single phrase circled in ready. "Let my people go." By October, Riverwood had become a mausoleum pretending to be a home. The air was heavy with sweetness, decay masked by perfume. The portraits on the walls had begun to fade, not with age but by choice. Faces that once stared down in judgment now turned away, features dissolving into the canvas. Catherine no longer rose from bed. She spoke to the ceiling in a voice calm and distant, as though addressing an unseen congregation. "It remembers everything," she whispered one morning to Grace. "Every scream, every name. It's building itself again, but not for us." Grace only nodded. "The house is returning to the ones who built it." The child grew without measure of days. By the time the first frost came, it could walk, or rather glide. It moved without sound, without weight, always near the walls, touching them with small, deliberate hands. Wherever it passed, wallpaper peeled away, revealing the rough timber beneath, and carved there, in charcoal and blood, were marks Isaiah had never seen before. Chains breaking, suns rising, names written in defiance. The townspeople spoke of Riverwood, now only in whispers. A light was said to burn inside even at midnight, the kind of light that made shadows move backward. Some claimed to hear the hum all the way from the road, a low chant that carried no words but filled the chest with dread. Isaiah tried to flee once. He saddled a horse and rode toward the river at dawn, but when he reached the edge, he found the water flowing the wrong way, uphill toward the house. His reflection stood in the current, watching him, unmoving. When he turned back, Grace was there, holding the child. "You can't run from your own signature," she said. That night, he found the family Bible. His father's, his grandfather's, every birth and death recorded in the same careful hand. Except now, beneath his name, another had been added: Isaiah Vanderhorst. Debt paid. He tore the page out, but the ink kept bleeding through his fingers, burning like acid. When he looked again, the name had vanished entirely. Grace entered the room, the child in her arms. "You see," she said softly, "the book no longer knows you." And in that moment, Isaiah realized the truth. The house no longer belonged to him. It never had. By the time the second frost came, Riverwood was no longer standing in the same world. The front doors opened onto fields that no longer matched the horizon. The oaks had grown taller overnight, their roots breaking through the soil like bones pushing through flesh. Even the air felt older, thicker, as if filled with breath that had been exhaled centuries ago and never released. Grace moved through it easily, as though this had always been her home. The servants who remained kept their eyes down, speaking only in murmurs. One tried to flee and was found at dawn, standing waist deep in the marsh, whispering scripture backward until his voice gave out. The rest understood. There was nowhere left to go. Catherine drifted between worlds entirely now. Sometimes she called for Isaiah, as though he were still a man she loved. Sometimes she called for Sarah, though the first wife had been dead for years. Once, in the dead of night, Isaiah heard her laughing softly and whispering to the child, "It's building something, isn't it? Something that doesn't need walls." The child, no longer quite a child, grew in silence. It barely spoke, yet every movement of its hands altered the air around it. When it touched a window pane, frost patterns bloomed outward into shapes that looked like script. Grace studied them, tracing the lines reverently. "They're remembering," she said. "Every name this house buried." Isaiah began hearing those names at night, voices rising from the floors, from beneath the very foundation. He recognized some: men he had bought, women he had punished, a child who had vanished one summer. The voices didn't accuse, they recited, like a ledger line by line, until sleep became a form of torture. One morning, he awoke to find the parlor completely transformed. The wallpaper was gone, replaced by carvings. figures in chains walking out of a burning house. But in each figure's face, Isaiah saw his own eyes staring back at him. He fell to his knees, begging Grace to stop whatever she had summoned. She only smiled. "I didn't summon anything. I freed it. You built this place to hold what you feared. All I did was open the door." Behind her, the child turned toward Isaiah and spoke its first word since birth. Quiet, measured, unmistakable. "Remember." The sound shook the house to its core. The first cracks appeared beneath the east wing. At dawn, the servants found the floorboards buckled upward, the ground below breathing, as if the earth itself were restless. Isaiah ordered it sealed, but each time they nailed the boards down, something pushed them back up from underneath, slowly, deliberately. By the third day, the board split apart entirely, revealing the dark soil beneath. What lay below was not soil, it was bone. Hundreds of them, small, delicate, and impossibly clean, stacked in perfect order. No smell, no decay, just the sterile precision of memory. Catherine saw them and began to weep, though she didn't seem afraid. "They've been waiting," she whispered. "All this time, waiting for him to look." Isaiah fell to his knees, the sight of it breaking something inside him. Every bone felt arranged, accounted for, like entries in one of his own ledgers. The child stood at the edge of the pit, its eyes reflecting the pale dawn light. "They are the foundation," Grace said softly. "You called it inheritance, but they were the price." That night, the walls began to move. The portraits of his ancestors stretched and warped, mouths opening as if gasping for breath. Words bled from the frames, ink dripping down like tears bought, bound, buried. The hallways lengthened, doors appeared where none had been, leading to rooms filled with nothing but air that smelled of ash and salt. Catherine no longer spoke in her own voice. Her whispers came in chorus now, dozens layered atop one another. "You thought the land could forget," the voices said. "You thought the river would wash it clean." Isaiah screamed at Grace, demanding to know what she had done. Grace turned toward him, calm as always. "I only kept the promise you made when you signed your name. You asked the land to serve your blood. Now it's collecting." The child reached down into the pit of bones and placed its small hand upon them. The entire house shuddered. The bones shifted, not chaotically, but in rhythm, aligning into spirals, forming patterns that pulsed with faint light. It looked less like death than language, something alive, speaking through arrangement. Then, from deep below, a sound rose, low and resonant, like a choir buried for centuries finally finding its breath. The house began to breathe again. The house didn't crumble. It transformed. Walls pulsed like lungs, each inhale drawing in centuries of silence, each exhale releasing something that should have stayed buried. The pit of bones had become a radiant wound, light spilling from it like molten truth. Isaiah stumbled backward, covering his eyes, but the light followed him, bending around corners, reaching up the stairs, seeping under every locked door like water reclaiming a floodplain. Catherine stood motionless beside Grace, her pupils blown wide, her body trembling in sync with the rhythm of the earth below. "Do you feel it?" she whispered, voice trembling with awe and terror. "It's the memory of ownership. Every soul that was priced, measured, and silenced." Her hand drifted toward the child. "They're speaking through us now." Isaiah shouted for patience, for the overseer, for anyone. But no one came. The household had fled into the night, leaving the master alone with what he'd purchased. The portraits along the stairwell had changed. No longer his ancestors, but strangers. Faces dark and familiar. Men, women, children, all staring back, eyes open, silent accusation burning through the veil of oil and canvas. Grace stepped closer to him, calm, poised, her voice lower now, no longer submissive, but commanding. "You bought a body," she said, "but the body was a vessel. You thought you could own the vessel without the soul, but souls remember who signed the paper. The light grew stronger until the furniture began to melt. Not with heat, but with erosion of reality itself. The piano warped, its strings humming without touch. Catherine's hair lifted as if underwater, her voice a thousandfold echo. You thought it ended when you sealed the report, when you buried the evidence, when you forgot her name. Isaiah clutched his head. I did what every man did. I followed the order of things. Grace's face hardened. The order of things was built on desecration, and desecration always demands return. Then the child, their child, stepped into the light. The skin along its arms shimmered, revealing veins like silver threads running upward into infinity. We are the debt, it said, eyes burning like stars seen through fog. And tonight, the account is balanced. Isaiah screamed as the light reached him. Every contract he had ever signed carved itself across his flesh, ink burning from the inside out. The house inhaled once more, and Riverwood began to remember. The light did not burn him, not at first. It read him. Every sin, every transaction, every command spoken in the language of ownership was recited back through the marrow of his bones. The voice of the land, or something older than land, cataloged him with the precision of a divine auditor. He saw numbers carved into air, ledgers of flesh and blood, columns of names stretching into eternity. Every one of them linked to his house, his lineage, his signature. Grace moved through the glow like a shadow that remembered it was once light. The price was never gold, she said, her tone low and unwavering. It was memory. And the more you forgot, the deeper the cost grew. She touched the child's shoulder, and the radiance around them deepened, not blinding, but wholly in a terrible way. Isaiah fell to his knees, his skin trembling under unseen pressure. Tell me what you are, he whispered. Grace's answer came like scripture. We are what you built, what you denied, what your God refused to see. We are the truth beneath the foundation, the inheritance of every man who believed power could be purchased. Catherine's voice layered over Grace's, soft but resolute. And you, Isaiah, are the last keeper of the illusion. The floor beneath him split into perfect symmetry, revealing a void beneath the estate. Not fire, not darkness, but movement. Thousands of forms twisting in rhythm, human shapes made of light and ash. They rose slowly, their faces undefined but present, the essence of everyone ever bound by ink and chain. The pit was not a grave. It was an archive. Grace turned to him, eyes calm. You can choose. Surrender your name and free what you've buried, or cling to it and join the ledger forever. Isaiah looked to Catherine for mercy, but her gaze was steady. Pity without forgiveness. You wanted legacy, she said. Now you see what it truly means. He tried to speak, but the light began to fill his mouth, pouring down his throat like molten truth. His scream was silent, devoured by the echo of centuries collapsing inward. Grace closed her eyes and whispered a single word, a word the language had tried to erase his remember. And with that command, Riverwood's foundation shifted again, not to destroy, but to awaken. The silence that followed was not empty. It was listening. Every stone, every nail, every fragment of glass in Riverwood seemed aware, holding its breath in anticipation. The walls pulsed faintly, not with light now, but with memory. The kind that breathes through generations, quiet, invisible, unbroken. Grace stood in the center of the hall, her figure outlined in that trembling half-glow. Catherine knelt beside her, one hand over her heart, the other gripping the child's small fingers. It's over, she whispered, but Grace shook her head. No, it's never over. The story doesn't end when the guilty fall. It ends when the silent remember. The light flickered, and for the first time, the voices in the air addressed you. Not Isaiah, not Catherine, you, the witness, the listener, the heir to a world built on someone else's obedience. You hear this? The voices murmured, layering over one another like distant waves. You live on their soil. You use their names. You breathe the comfort they were denied. So understand the ledger never closed. It was only hidden under comfort, under history, under distraction. Grace turned her head slightly, as if she could see through time, through the thin veil separating her century from yours. You were taught to believe freedom was a gift. It was never a gift. It was an exchange. You live in a system refined from the plantation, rebranded through institutions, polished by the illusion of progress. The chains just changed form. Her voice deepened, colder now. Do you think you are free because you vote, because you choose your distractions, because you call your servitude by another name? The child looked up, eyes glowing with the same terrible knowing. They made you a custodian of your own cage, he said. Grace raised her hand toward the ceiling. Riverwood was the prototype, the blueprint of obedience dressed as civilization. And what was done here has never stopped being done, just digitized, just sanctified. Then her gaze fixed on the unseen audience, sharp as a blade through the dark. If you've listened this far, you've already been marked by awareness. That's how it begins. Knowledge is contagion. As she took a single breath, deliberate and commanding. To seal your awakening, write these words below twice. The blood remembers. That is how you cross the threshold. The air trembled again, not with fear but with initiation. When Grace spoke again, her tone shifted, quieter, sharper, almost surgical. You think the past is gone because the dates are old, she said, but time is not linear. It loops like a chain around the throat of memory. Every empire that learned to own flesh learned to own thought, and they never stopped refining that method. The walls of Riverwood flickered, and suddenly the viewer wasn't just seeing a plantation. They were seeing skyscrapers, glass towers, polished boardrooms. The same geometry, the same hierarchy, reborn in marble and digital light. Grace walked through the vision as if through history's mirror. The plantation became the factory. The factory became the institution. The institution became the algorithm. She gestured upward, where invisible strings shimmered in the air, connecting symbols, currency, religion, governance, media. Every system you call civilization has one secret function: to manage human will. The whip became the contract. The overseer became the executive. The branding iron became the brand. Catherine's voice rose faintly, carried through the echoing house, and the same fear remains. Fear of losing what was never truly yours. Grace turned her gaze directly to you. You were born into this system, conditioned to obey, to consume, to compete, to believe that control equals safety. But safety was never the goal. Compliance was. And the moment you question it, they call you dangerous. They call you mad. The child stepped forward, holding a mirror carved from light. Look, he said, this is the modern master's face. The reflection rippled. 1,000 faces: politicians, CEOs, preachers, influencers, teachers, each reciting the same doctrine in different tongues. Be productive. Be loyal. Be silent. Grace's expression softened, but her words carried the weight of centuries. The same script that enslaved bodies now enslaves belief. They don't need chains when you build your own cage out of comfort. She took one step closer, voice low, commanding. The difference between a slave and a citizen is awareness. Awareness terrifies them, because an aware man cannot be owned. The light in the hall dimmed, leaving only the faint pulse of breath and truth. And now, she whispered, you are aware. What you do with that awareness determines which side of the ledger your soul will be written on. Grace's eyes narrowed, and the air thickened as though history itself was leaning closer to listen. Every system has an author, she said, and the architects of control never wore crowns or uniforms. They wore robes, seals, and signatures. They understood one truth. Power doesn't need visibility. It needs belief. The house around her dissolved into another image. Parchment scrolls, quill marks, courtroom seals pressed into hot wax. The blueprint began long before Riverwood, she continued. Before nations, before law. It was born the moment men decided divine order could be written in ink. Behind her, silhouettes appeared: merchants, clerics, bankers, noblemen. They spoke in overlapping whispers, ancient words that became modern languages. Covenant, contract, collateral, debt. Grace raised her voice over them. They bound the spirit of man to the ledger. They turned breath into credit. They turned life into interest. They built an invisible empire where obedience masquerades as morality. Catherine stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. "You mean the church," she said. "The crown, the court." Grace shook her head slowly. "Not one, all." The pillars of civilization became one organism, each feeding the other. The priest sanctifies the rule. The ruler enforces the creed. The banker measures the worth. Together, they crafted the illusion of divine hierarchy, the belief that some are born to command and others to obey. As she spoke, the walls filled with moving symbols: the cross, the scepter, the coin, the flag, each glowing, merging, until they formed a single eye suspended in air, watching everything. "That eye," Grace said softly, "has changed names 1,000 times. Empire, republic, church, market, state, but its hunger has never changed." The child's voice echoed beneath hers, clear, haunting. They learned that control doesn't last through force. It lasts through faith. Make the slave believe he is free, and he will defend his chains. The house trembled again, but this time not in rage, in revelation. Grace's eyes locked with yours. "You were raised to think rebellion means violence. But the truest rebellion is withdrawal, the refusal to feed the system your belief. That's what terrifies the most a man who sees." Her voice lowered, intimate, dangerous. "You are beginning to see." The air of Riverwood turned electric, as though invisible circuitry ran beneath its rotting floorboards. Grace lifted her hand, and the house shifted again. Time collapsing, centuries folding into a single frame, the plantation blurred into a modern skyline. Glass towers replaced slave quarters, data streams replaced chains, and the hum of machinery echoed like a prayer. "This is the new plantation," she said quietly. "You walk through it every day." Screens glowed where windows once stood. Every surface shimmered with color. Advertisements, algorithms, faces smiling with perfect obedience. They learned to harvest something deeper than labor. Grace continued. "They harvest attention, emotion, consent. Every moment you look, they measure you. Every click is a confession." Catherine stared in disbelief. "So were the ones trapped now?" Grace nodded. The overseer's whip became a notification. The master's voice became the feed. "You build their power with your silence, and call it connection." She gestured to the glowing devices, their light pulsing like heartbeats. "They taught you to crave your own surveillance." The child approached one of the screens. His reflection flickered between past and present. A field hand, a factory worker, a modern citizen. Same pattern, he murmured, different costume. Grace's tone sharpened. "When you scroll, when you worship productivity, when you measure your worth in numbers, you are speaking the language of the ledger, the one first written in blood." Or she turned to you, her eyes piercing through the illusion. "Understand this, the system doesn't need to enslave everyone. It only needs to keep you believing in it, to make you protect it, defend it, fear its absence. They've made you dependent on your own containment." The light in the room began to flicker, each flash showing another layer of truth. The plantation, the factory, the city, all stacked atop one another like geological strata of obedience. Every age builds its comfort on another's suffering. Grace whispered, "That is the inheritance you breathe." The house exhaled a slow, resonant sigh, like something awakening beneath the surface. Grace looked up, her face bathed in the cold glow of the screens. "But awareness," she said, is infection. The more who see, the weaker the structure becomes. She leaned forward, her voice lowering to a whisper that cut through centuries. And tonight, Riverwood isn't the only house that's waking up. The sound began as a hum, low and constant, threading through the floorboards like electricity beneath skin. It wasn't just in Riverwood anymore. It was everywhere. Grace stood still, listening. "Do you hear it?" she asked softly. "That's the sound of recognition. It's spreading." The walls pulsed, showing flashes of other places. A subway car where every passenger stared blankly at their screens. A classroom where children recited pledges they didn't understand. A boardroom where a man signed a contract without reading the words that would bind him. Each scene flickered in and out, merging with the house like mirrors folding into one another. Catherine staggered backward, clutching her head. "They're all seeing it," she whispered. "The whole world." Grace nodded. "The veil can't hold forever. When one mind wakes, it calls to the next. Awareness is contagious, and contagion terrifies those who live by control." The child looked up at her. "Will they destroy us for it?" "They'll try," Grace said. "They always do. They'll call it madness, misinformation, heresy. They'll flood the world with noise to drown the silence that truth requires." Her gaze turned toward the unseen horizon, but they can't unhear what's been heard. Outside, thunder rolled, not from the sky, but from within the earth. The ground trembled as if something beneath it was shifting, alive. Riverwood's great oak split open, its roots glowing like veins of molten gold. From within, faint figures emerged, not ghosts, but echoes of every soul the system had consumed. Workers, mothers, prophets, rebels. Their faces were neither living nor dead. They were remembering. Grace stepped forward, her shadow long and deliberate. "They are not rising to haunt," she said. "They are rising to balance. The debt has matured." Catherine fell to her knees, tears streaking her face. "What happens now?" Grace turned to her slowly. "Now the world must choose. Submission or sight. You can't serve both." The hum deepened, resonating through bone and memory alike. Every screen in every city flickered once, twice, then went dark. For the first time in generations, the world stood in silence, unmediated, unfiltered. Grace looked upward, whispering to the unseen witnesses beyond Riverwood. "The machine can't survive a world that refuses to look away." And somewhere, in that silence, something vast exhaled. The silence did not last. It fractured, not with sound but with reaction. Across cities, people woke into confusion. Some wept without knowing why. Others screamed, desperate to return to the noise that had once kept them numb. Screens blinked back to life, but they no longer obeyed. The algorithm spoke in symbols indecipherable, looping fragments of language that no longer sold, no longer soothed. Grace watched it unfold through the trembling air. "The system is self-aware now," she murmured. "It's rewriting itself to survive." Catherine's reflection appeared in a nearby window, but the face looking back was different. Older, worn. "They're afraid," she said. "Not of us, but of what they've built." Grace nodded. "Because they built a god they can't control. One born of consumption, fed by attention, baptized in apathy." In the vision before them, people divided. Some knelt before the flickering screens, whispering prayers to the remnants of their routines. Restore the feed, restore the order. Others walked into the streets, stunned, finally aware of the air, the weight of their own thoughts. Without the constant hum of distraction, the world felt unbearable, raw, unfiltered, alive. The child moved closer to the vision, eyes wide. "Is this freedom?" he asked. Grace shook her head gently. "No, this is withdrawal. Freedom comes after the tremor, when you stop mistaking control for care." She turned to Catherine. "You see it, don't you? The split, not between rich and poor, or believer and skeptic, but between those who need the cage and those who would rather die than return to it." Outside, Riverwood began to crumble. Its timbers groaned, its portraits bled light, its foundations heaved. Yet it didn't fall. It shed. Layer after layer of paint and plaster peeled away, revealing what lay beneath, not decay, but growth. Roots pushing through stone. The house was no longer a monument. It was becoming soil again. Grace raised her hand, and a faint wind passed through the open halls. "Every empire ends this way," she said. "Not with destruction, but with reclamation." Catherine reached for her. "And us." Grace smiled, almost tender. "We are the memory returning to truth." The house breathed once more, and the world beyond began to tremble with the same pulse.